Hey guys, so similar to my previous staple analysis, I thought I'd take a look back at the premier events so far in 2022 and map out the historical trend of the most played hand traps based on the data. And before I continue, a big thanks to all of my sponsors. I'll have all of their discount codes and links down below in case you're hunting for some Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. Now, for those of you that are familiar with my channel, you'll know that whenever we have some premier Yu-Gi-Oh event, I typically provide a breakdown of the most played hand traps among the topping list. So starting with the first event included in this video, goes as far as back as February when we had the remote duel YCS. Then we have YCS Charlotte, which was the first in-person YCS that we had since the pandemic started. And so then we cover some of the TCG championships as well as Euros, as well as some of the recent YCS events that we've had in the fall. Now the events included are based on when I did the analytical breakdown of the YCS events, so I am missing a couple, such as the North American Championship, as I never had time to analyze that one, but I do have almost all of the events included here. Now first, let's start with the trend of the median number of hand traps played in the main deck in the past year. So we start off with the remote duel YCS with the median of 9 hand traps in the main, where at this point we had Prank Kids Adventure and Dragon Link Adventure as the best decks, and as you can tell with the pie chart, all of these decks require some form of hand traps to try to slow them down. Now what's crazy is that for YCS Charlotte, you saw the median number just absolutely balloon up to 15, and this was largely because of the huge popularity of 60 card pile decks, which brought the number of hand traps being played up along with it. Since then, the median number of hand traps in the main hovered between 7 to 9 until it got really low at just 3 for YCS Utrecht. Now if you recall, this is where Runic Sprite was very popular and won the event piloted by Joshua Schmidt, and that deck did not really play any hand traps and instead relies on powerful spells as well as main deck lava golems, which seem to be pretty popular. However, since then, the median number of hand traps has only increased and increased through the events, and this is largely thanks to the release of Bestials and tier elements being so strong that it warranted a high number of Bestials in the main. Not to mention, as of Pasadena, which was post Magnificent Mavens, this also led to the play of Herald of Orange Light and Kelbeck, which were categorized as hand traps for my breakdowns, so artificially increasing the median hand trap count, even though Kelbeck for the most part is not really played as a hand trap as its main purpose. As for the side deck, the median number of hand traps has actually been relatively stable and looks like it's usually around 3 hand traps. Looks like the trend is to just focus the hand traps in the main, with the more powerful but matchup specific hand traps like Dimension Shifter being delegated for the side deck, which you typically see with decks like Sprite, as well as any other rogue strategies that may be able to play under Shifter, but just not as optimally as a deck like Flunder for example. Now let's cover the historical trend so far in 2022 for the most well-known hand traps in more detail, so let me help you interpret this graph along with the caveats that you need to know. Basically, the percentages represent the proportion of topping decks that played a certain hand trap, in this case Ash, at whatever event for that month. So keep in mind that the denominator is different for each event depending on the number of players in that top cut, so I would say don't focus too much on the exact percentages but more so the trend. Now as you can see, Ash Blossom used to be the unanimous number 1 played hand trap, really started seeing an increase in play in Charlotte thanks to the rampant use of Fusion Destiny, and in Bogota and Guadalajara due to the introduction of Branded Despia and many other strategies using Branded Fusion, which warranted the use of Ash in most players' lists. But by Euros, the play of Ash did decline, and in Euros was where we first saw more popularity of the Power Spell Sprite rather than Hand Trap Sprite. Ash was still hanging on though until the release of Bestials, where they took over first place, and not to mention the top cut representation in the last few YCS events were mostly tier limits, which do not really play your standard hand traps, and thus brought these figures down for essentially all hand traps. But to be fair, for decks outside of tier limits, I actually think Ash is pretty decent this format to stop those Agito or Kelbeck mills if you're a deck that doesn't benefit from the cards hitting the grave. Next we have Infinite Impermanence, where earlier in the year this card was steadily increasing in play and was at one point the most played hand trap among the topping list at the YCS. This was primarily because for Sprite, they were mainly bringing out red for the monster negate, but Imperm would play around that, and hitting Gigantic Sprite was rather huge, especially early on before Sprint was released. Imperm on Kikalos was very strong and is still very impactful even now. But sadly, again, since tier elements started to take a majority of the top cut, you just didn't see a lot of the traditional hand traps being played among topping lists, and explaining its decline. If you are playing a deck that is not tier, I would say Imperm is the one hand trap that you should definitely play if you have the room, as it's great against tiers and also plays around talents, which tiers are playing for the most part. Then we have Nibiru, which has a rather weird looking pattern in terms of its play, but despite the pattern, it was actually consistently one of the most played hand traps in topping lists for a while. Even at the initial release of Power the Elements with Sprite entering the mix, and people assuming that Nibiru would be bad because of Gigantic Sprite's level 2 lock, it actually ended up being very impactful because Nibiru plus any other hand trap essentially could wipe the Sprite board before they could get set up. Against the Danger variant of Tears, which was popular around the time of YCS Niagara, could still have impact against them as well. Sadly, since YCS Minneapolis, which was after Darkwing Blast was legal, Nibiru sort of became obsolete because for one, Rocalis was now legal, which just stops Nibiru outright, and even before Magnificent Mavens, Tears were by far the most represented deck at Top Cut. Nibiru had a really long run of being one of the most played and one of the most impactful hand traps ever, but is now a long forgotten card in a way, but I'm sure it will make its way back again as this Tier 0 format passes eventually. Then we have a hand trap that is notorious for being format dependent, which is Droll. Usually in most formats it's not played too often, although at the South and Central American TCG Championships it was actually the third most played hand trap. Now Punk variants, Sword Soul and Branded Despia were the top decks at the time, and Droll definitely was strong against at least the Punk stuff, and pretty good against the other two strategies as well. But for the most part, since that format, it's really plummeted in play and is not utilized much. Both Tearlaments and Sprite can play through Droll and set up some pretty nasty stuff, and while Droll is good against Flunder, it can also potentially be useless if they have Shifter, meaning that this card is not really doing anything against the top 3 decks right now. Not to mention we now have Defissure and Macrocosmos at 3, and this card does have to be able to go to the graveyard to use its effect. Next, a very old card that is historic compared to some of the hand traps we've covered so far, and that is Effect Veiler. Was pretty consistent in its usage in the earlier part of the year, especially when Halqifibrax was still legal, as this provided an easy access code line for decks like Sky Striker, which, before you scoff, was actually one of the most competitive strategies earlier in the year. Since then, like all the hand traps, it has been declining in play, but like what I said about Imperm, negating Kikalos is pretty significant, and for certain rogue decks, Effect Veiler is a good bridge for Small World as well. Then we have Gamma, which is pretty interesting because for the most part it's usually the 4th or 5th most played hand trap and has been rather consistent in how often it is played. Now this is actually one of the traditional hand traps that's actually still seeing play, as for example in Tears is a way to stop opponents' D-Shifter, and is now even more important with Herald of Orange Light going to 1. If you see my YCS Top Cut breakdowns, you'll see that Gamma is only ever cited in the topping list if it's played at all, but in the right matchups it can just flat out end turns. Next we have DD Crow, which has this funny pattern where it was not seeing much play, then started seeing a ton of play once Sprite and Tearlaments became legal post Power of the Elements, because hitting the Ronin Totem was huge, and hitting any of the tier names to prevent their fusions was huge as well, and was essentially seen as a mandatory card to play. Now even before the release of Bestials, the play of Crow actually started to see a decline, but now that we have these big 2500 attack DD Crows and Bestials with added effects, the use of Crow has sort of disappeared as of the most recent event. Still a good card and can also banish spells and traps in the grave, which is unique, and so perhaps the play of Crow will return again someday. Next we have Ghost Spell, which when we got to YCS Bogota and Guadalajara, it was the most played hand trap because this is when Branded Despia was first legal. Now you see that the play in Belle plummeted right after that because I think players realized that Belle was not actually spectacular in this matchup, and if anything, DD Crow might be better because Branded Despia players were chain blocking to play around Belle. Since then, the play of Belle has not been too high, although in recent events there actually has been a small uptick because this card can be good to not only stop Tearlament fusion plays, but also to prevent those shufflebacks from the grave thanks to Keldo and Mudora. Definitely has a place in this current format for all the other decks out there. Then we have another Ghost Girl in Ogre, which saw its popularity during the time where we had adventure token stuff running rampant after its initial release, and not to mention Ogre was good against Flunder and their map as well. But when Branded Despia became the dominant deck by the South and Central American TCG Championships, Ghost Ogre saw almost no play as it was not that great against that deck, and since then has not really seen much play. Definitely not good against Tears right now, and when Sprite was first released it at least saw some play because the Gigantic was huge to hit, but now they have the sprint play available which allows them to play through interruptions better, so Ogre has rather disappeared. And finally we have Dimension Shifter, which for the longest time was exclusive to Flunder decks in terms of decks that made top cut, but now usually you see Sprite decks at least siding this card to have a chance against Tearlaments. From a rogue standpoint, the only rogue decks that are playable right now are decks that can utilize Shifter in some way, and so this card is seeing an increase in play for a reason. The OCG did semi-limit this card, and I wish TCG did the same since they brought back Macrocosmos and Defissure to 3, but likely it's here to stay until they directly hit Tears on the next list. Alright guys, so that was it for the historical overview of the most played hand traps. Hope you found that interesting. I did not include newer hand traps like Bestials since they've only been around for the last few events only, but I'm sure they will eventually make these videos. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Bear Lord, Spooky Boogie, Steven Phillips, and Chaz Blanks, as always, for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care, guys.